because he was able to. He was somehow able to weaponize a national and actually global health crisis. But we figured, okay, well, there's certainly no way that wearing a mask is going to be an issue, right? Not wearing a mask could never be a political statement, could it? We never thought that we'd ever see Bill Gates being brought up. We never thought we'd see large groups of white people storming Capitol buildings with semi-automatic weapons because they wanted to get a haircut or go to the gym. Certainly, we never suspected that in March. Not in our year. 2020 was going to be our year. But at the very least, we thought that a historic pandemic and the resulting economic disaster and national fractures would be all that we'd have to deal with. If that happened, we thought at least we could concentrate on that grieving and those losses and just kind of stay home. I mean, not in our year. Nothing more is going to happen in our year. We didn't think we'd have to read about a black woman in Louisville being murdered in her bedroom in the middle of the night by unidentified police officers. We didn't think we'd have to see a black man chased down the streets of South Georgia and executed in the road by 2 white vigilantes. We didn't think we'd have to watch a white police officer in Minneapolis kneeling on a black man's neck and ignoring his pleas for breath for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until he died. And we thought that once we saw that we'd never have to see white friends make property more valuable than people. We never thought we'd see a president start to advocate shooting looters or threatening them with vicious dogs or gassing people for a photo op with a Bible that he doesn't even know how to hold because he's never seen one up close. We never thought that he would suggest that a 75-year-old man pushed to the ground by police was actually a terrorist. Not in our year. That cannot happen in 2020 because 2020 was going to be our year. Well, the bad news, friends, is 2020 is only halfway over. But actually, the really good news tonight, friends, is 2020 is only halfway over. 2020 was supposed to be our year, the year for diversity and equality and love and justice and compassion, and it can still be the year for those things. You know, ever since the restrictions and the cancellations and the changes began, right, way back before we used words like social distancing or self-isolation or flattening the curve, we've all been asking the same question. People ask me that question every day. John, when are things going to get back to normal? Well, they won't. Because returning to normal would involve some precise dividing line by which we could delineate the end of this and the beginning of something else, right? It would suggest that if there were such a line that we could cross it without carrying these days into it with us, but we know that that's an impossibility. We know that we can't ever leave anything fully behind, can we? Because we're all walking around with the emotional souvenirs of every day that we've lived here. And we know that nothing was created in November of 2016. It was only revealed, right? It was only illuminated. It was nurtured. It was boosted. But it didn't begin on a single day in November. But so the experiences we're having now and that we've had since March and that we've had over the last 4 years, they've been renovating us. They've been reshaping us. We absorb and internalize everything and it gets stored up in our minds and our bodies, and it's actually shaped who you are right now. So I want to ask you as we begin, how are these days renovating you? How are you being reshaped? What thoughts are you thinking? What new dreams are you dreaming? What new questions are you asking? And to really lean into those things. Because hopefully soon, yes, the spread of the virus is going to slow and we'll get a vaccine and we'll see some of the regular rhythms of our life return. We'll be able to go to school or to work or to sporting events, or we'll be able to get hand sanitizer without selling an organ on the dark web. But none of the normal things that we do after these days, they're not going to go unchanged. For months, we're going to be contending with distancing and we'll likely, hopefully, be wearing masks in public. And large events will include all kinds of safety protocols we've never had to contend with before. We'll probably approach air travel very differently and public spaces very differently. If we're responsible human beings, we're going to have to change our habits, and we're going to have to use caution until those vaccines are available. Now, many of us are going to have to find new jobs or change our spending habits, and we're going to need to reschedule events and plans that were interrupted. We're going to have to reinvest in relationships in person that have been affected either by distance or by close proximity. You know, I've been with my family here for 4 months, and I found out that they have some, annoying traits. They breathe funny. They breathe in and out all the time. It drives you nuts. But everything is going to be altered going forward because of the pandemic, but also because of the days we've been experiencing over the last 2 or 3 weeks. Because what's going to happen is some of the fight for racial justice is going to feel less volatile and seemingly less urgent than it does right now. There's going to be less activity. There's going to be fewer massive protests. But we're never going to be able to unsee the video we've seen. We're never going to unhear what we've heard from people we love. We can't place under the covers everything that's been revealed. And we're going to have to continue in the coming days to face our privilege, to expose systemic sicknesses, to push back against people who want America's greatness to be aligned with whiteness. And we're going to have to do all this readjusting and all this recalibrating, all while heading quickly into the most important election of our lifetimes with all the upheaval and turbulence that will bring. No wonder you're tired right now. I was on a chat with some friends last week, and one of my friends said, I don't think we're prepared for the amount of PTSD counseling that we're all going to need. We're all going to have to unpack fear and grief and the relational collateral damage of these days. So can we ever get back to normal? That's probably not going to happen. And you know what? I don't want normal. I've seen enough normal, haven't you? I mean, this is like Groundhog Day. You've probably seen that movie if you're an older person, like me. It's a movie about a man who is stuck reliving the exact same day over and over again. He's trapped in a loop that he can't seem to get out of, and he's trying to figure out how to change his fate. And every day over the past almost 4 years has probably felt like Groundhog Day to vulnerable, marginalized, oppressed communities who feel under more duress than ever here. They haven't had any rest from the threat. They haven't had any respite from that sort of routine of oppression. But with the self-isolation and the restrictions, many of our days, even if we're not part of vulnerable communities, they've begun to look the same. And it isn't just our geography that's been relatively unchanged, right? I was sort of struggling to put into words what I was feeling today, because I feel like I have said these things before, and I recognize it's because I've felt this way before. I noticed how similar and repetitive these days seem to be, at least for me, maybe not for you, but I know that I wake up in the morning after a night of restless, interrupted sleep because of the disaster the day before. And now when my head had hit the pillow the night before, I had been thinking about how difficult and how stressful and how sad the day had been, but I trusted that things would get better the next day. I thought, well, it can't get worse, right? And so the next morning, my eyes would open and I realize I'm awake. And for a brief second, I sort of forget. I feel the split second of involuntary hope and expectancy and optimism, but then the sameness sets in again. Soon I check Twitter or I turn on the news, and suddenly it's all repeating. Once again, we're in another unnecessary constitutional crisis. Once again, I'm having to summon up and channel the adrenaline to confront a new onslaught of real and manufactured emergencies. Once more, we're all having to desperately appeal to public servants to do the decent and humane thing, and once again, seeing them flatly refuse. Once again, we're trying to convince followers of Jesus that they're supposed to care about people. Once more, we're all dancing through the minefield conversations at family gatherings and doing all sorts of verbal gymnastics to sidestep relational explosions. We're trying every day to keep loving people that we've learned really disturbing things about. Once more, we're being reminded of the white supremacy that our churches have been afflicted with. Once more, we're seeing news stories of emboldened bigots showing up as neighbors and elementary school teachers and local politicians and coffee shop patrons because they feel a kindred embittered spirit in the White House. And once more, every morning, we're scrolling through boastful, nonsensical, provocative presidential tweets littered with Democratic slander, wall-building taunts, and abject lies. And friends, do you see what happens with this repetition? With all this, there's an emotional muscle memory that comes with it. It's a repetition of grieving. It's a repetition of loss. It's a repetition of separation. And that's not a healthy diet for us. Our brains and our bodies were not meant to sustain that kind of prolonged emotional stress, that kind of prolonged grief. And so that's the problem. The normal is the problem. That this terrible normal is what's weighing you down, it's what's weighing me down. The pattern of attrition. See, routine can be really helpful, right? It can be stabilizing, it can be healthy. Structure is normally a pretty good thing, but when fear and grief and conflict become routine, when instability is the norm, well, you can easily find yourself growing hopeless. That may be where you are tonight. You may be living right in the heart of Hopelessville. You may be the mayor of Hopelessville. And when people are hopeless, they give up. When people are hopeless, they stop trying. When people grow hopeless, they believe the days will never change, and so they stop trying to change the days. I saw a friend of mine recently, and she said, I don't pay attention to anything political, and I block people who talk about all that. And I said to her, you know, the all that, really, that's where the life is. All that is where we are our best humans, right? All that is where people's lives reside. And so my friend is a good person, but she has decided that the way to not live the same horrible normal over and over is to ignore it all. And I worry as I talk to people that many people, they have this repetition sickness. They're so used to bad news that they're beginning to accept it as normal. And many people have lost the expectancy of the better and the possibility of change and the possibility of being surprised by goodness. And I don't want you to do that. Because I know that what we're experiencing now, what we're seeing about America, this is not new to you. I mean, you're the helpers and the healers and the lovers and the caregivers and the table makers and the dam givers. That's who you are. You have been looking at the nation with an X-ray for a long time, right? If we look at something with an X-ray, we see below the surface and we can see the damage that's not on the surface. And so you've been looking at the world as an activist or a caregiver. You've been looking at America with an X-ray. So you've seen the prejudice. You know the bigotry's there. You sense the systemic inequality. That's why you do the work you do. That's why you care about the things you care about. That's why you're on this call tonight. And what we're seeing in America now is that it's so bad that we now have a compound fracture that everyone can see it breaking through the surface. So we can see the ugliness now, so it can't be denied. So what we're seeing is a lot more people now are sensing just how bad it is, which is actually great. It's actually a gift because we get to invite people in to a better story. We get to wake up their imaginations and tell them, I know you see it now. Let me show you what we can do about it. I have a good friend whose name is Sally. And Sally, right around the time of the election in 2016, she decided she had to do something. And she said, I started to reach out to people whose politics and theology were very different than my own. Now, Sally was a fairly conservative Christian who had evolved to the point of being a Unitarian, so a really far move from right to left. So she started inviting people who were really conservative over to her house every Sunday to play bridge and to have lunch and to talk about life. And you're probably thinking, well, that sounds really beautiful, but it isn't. Not to Sally, because on many weeks, Sally would say, oh, you see what's going on in the news and what I'm going to have to deal with in my home. So if you still pray, please pray for me, right? And Sally was telling me about one of the conversations they were having not long ago. And they were talking about the racial divide in America. And one of the women there started to tear up. And my friend Sally said, well, tell me what's going on. And this woman said, I just don't know why God made other races. And now I wasn't there, thankfully, because I would have just used that moment to be a real wise guy. I would have said, hey, did you know that Adam and Eve weren't Caucasian, right? Or I would have said, did you know the cradle of civilization didn't come with a Cracker Barrel? I would have said something like that. But Sally actually said, tell me more. And this woman said, well, if God hadn't made other races, we wouldn't have these divides. Racism wouldn't exist. And what my friend Sally heard in this woman and what I've heard in that woman was a genuine grief over what the person was seeing, but a really bad story about why it exists. She had a really bad God story, and she thought that she was the baseline of race, and so everyone outside of her were other races. But I can work with someone who has a good heart and a bad story, because I can try to give them a better story. And I think in these days, what we have is the opportunity now, with everything that's happening, with people beginning to shift, with more people coming on board the fight for equality, even in the last week, you and I, we have opportunity to talk to other people and to sort of wake them up to what we've seen. But so here we are, and it's nighttime, and we're at the close of another day with so many familiar feelings, right? A pattern of pain, such familiar loss. We've had more incendiary tweets today. We've had more intentional viciousness, more reminders of the divides, more exhaustion. And the question becomes, how can we live in such a way that we shape a different reality, that we can escape the repetitive cycle of grieving? I would say that part of the way we do this is we take an inventory of our personal progression. My son just turned 15, and he's frustrated by the fact that he's not growing at a certain rate. But what he doesn't see is that he's growing at a tremendous rate. He's just there inside his body, so he can't tell. So it's difficult to step back and to see where we've grown physically, but it's even more difficult to step back and see where we've grown emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. So I want to ask you to think about that, because you're not the same person you were when the pandemic started. You're not the same person you were before you saw the George Floyd video. What are you learning right now? What are you finding out about yourself? How are your relationships changing? What new skills have you acquired? What new questions are you getting? What is stirring in you that might not have been stirring before? So we don't have normal. We never did in some ways. We only had the present, right? We only get this moment. We don't get the past or the future. We get this moment. I was talking to my daughter, and she had one of those epiphanies that 10-year-olds have. She said, Dad, did you know that the minute you say the word now, it's not now anymore? And she said, now. She said, see, they're all gone. And I said, yeah, it's really hard to live in the present. But this is important for us now, to stay present, despite all we've been through and despite all we're worried about, to stay focused on the work and the task of this moment, of this day. I mean, we can't really pinpoint when all this began, right? So it isn't going to simply end. There's no line between this time and the coming seasons. There are just our realizations and our realities and a series of interconnected moments. But what I know is that some people have been changed by these days, and we're not changing back. Communities have been altered, and we're not going to go back to where we were before. Something else is going to come. It's going to interrupt our plans and our comfort and our security and our routine, and then we'll have that present in which to choose. So normal is probably not an option, but you know what's an option? Better. In the wake of this pandemic, we can come through this with a different appreciation for the people we love. We can find joy in the simple things we'd forgotten were so readily available to us before they were taken away. We can have a greater compassion for the pain of people around us. We can aspire to live more intentionally, given the fact that we recognize how fragile life is. We can actually let this pandemic and let this tragedy alter us in a way that changes us for the better, that crafts a better future. And in the wake of the deaths of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and all the protests that we've seen that have galvanized us, we can become bold, intentional anti-racists. We can start living in such a way that anti-racism, it's not an event, but it's actually a lifestyle. We can make Black Lives Matter more than just a hashtag. We can actually, as white people, many of us, we can actually tick off our white friends. We can actually interrupt our uncle's next racist diatribe. We can mess up our holiday gatherings. We can get blocked by our high school classmates. We can be so loud in our call for equality that we confront our ministers, that we turn over some tables in our church, that we lose some people we love. We can be so committed to anti-racist work as a lifestyle that we brave the eye rolls of coworkers, that we don't get invited to the next neighborhood Christmas party. We may be so bold in our work now that we brave tear gas and rubber bullets and arrest. We may be so filled with the passion for equality that we confront our privilege even more, that we speak more boldly, that we correct our own assumptions, that we get a better story. We may actually live in such a way that we get off the fence of ambiguity and into the fray of clarity. So the pandemic and the racial divide, those things can actually recreate America in a beautiful way and recreate us in a beautiful way. And that's what it's doing. These things are actually altering us. 2 years ago, back in 2018, that was the first year that I was with the folks in Huntsville in person. And I asked you all to think about what you had witnessed since the 2016 elections, all the goodness and the activism and the political engagement and the compassionate acts and the brave people. And I said, tell me what you've seen. Because I told you then that hope was found there. Nothing has changed in this. Have you seen anything in 2020 that makes you hopeful? Because I have. In the past 7 days alone, I've been inundated with fresh encouragement about humanity and about how many good human beings are out there and what we can actually do, what we're capable of when we see someone in peril. I've seen it. I've seen first-time activists coming out of the closet of their quietness. I've seen grandmas mobilizing on social media. I've seen nonprofits kind of taking up the slack in people's lives and helping them when they're stuck at home. And we've seen streets filled to overflowing with disparate people demanding that Black lives be valued. And here's the best part. I've seen people who have never said anything online suddenly say something, and I was shocked. But I realized, guess what? There's more people in the fight now. The fight is worse, but there are more people here. That's why 2020 can still be our year. Despite how terrifying and draining and heartbreaking and grief-inducing it's been, it can still be a beautiful year. If we only look at what we did over the past 7 days, imagine what we could do with 147 days. Because that's how many days we have left until that's next Tuesday in November that can flip the script. 147 days from today, we could wake up in a different America. We can feel the glorious abnormal of hope again. We can wake to the dawn of something else, to the beginning of a season that is marked by something other than malevolence and cruelty and exclusion. Now, everything isn't going to disappear. We know this. The bigotry and the prejudice and the racism and the homophobia, the xenophobia, it's not going to go away. but the good people will be able to sort of take a breath, because we won't have to spend every waking moment trying to protect ourselves from our own government. And then we can rest for a brief moment and celebrate a little, and then get about the work of crafting an America where every person is seen and heard and respected. 147 days, and guess what? This can still be our year. The year equality and diversity and love and justice and compassion brought a plot twist to the really long and incredibly sad story that we've been living in. I do a lot of traveling normally, and I do a lot of listening when I travel. I try to. And I hear hundreds of stories. And I don't consider myself, even though I'm an author and a pastor, I consider myself primarily a collector of stories, like a war correspondent. I go into a new area and I get into the trenches with people and I say, tell me what's happening here on the ground so I can tell the folks back home. And they give me proximity to their pain. They give me a front row seat to their sadness and to their worry. And then I take those conversations and I try to say, what are they trying to tell me? What are they trying to say? If I could let their voices be heard, what would I write? And that's what I share. And sometimes the words I write because of that are angry, or they're grieving, or they're frustrated, or they're confrontational. Sometimes those words bring turbulence because they need to. And this is sort of where you come in. Because when I travel, and it doesn't matter who I'm talking to, there's a pattern, whether it's a transgender teenager or a Muslim ministry in Tennessee, or a man who's been living in the church for 2 years, or a group of Black activists. They all say, well, here's what they never say. They never say, John, can you be less bold? Could you be less loud? Could you be less explicit? What they tend to say over and over again is, why are so many white progressives and moderate Christians still so silent? And I think that's a defining characteristic of privilege of any kind. It's the feeling that you have the luxury of time, of not rushing, or of decorum even. So what we know is that we're a divided nation, right? We know we're in the midst of really, practically speaking, a civil war, but the divide isn't the one we think. The divide is not a black and white divide, as much as the president might like to frame it that way. And the divide isn't really Republican versus Democrat that clearly. And it isn't a progressive Christian versus conservative Christian divide. It's really a vision divide. It's a divide in how we see ourselves and the world and the idea of community. There's the divide between the people of compassion and those who lack empathy. There are people who live life with open hands and those who feel compelled to live with a closed fist. There are people who see this world and this nation and this life as abundance, that there's enough for all of us if we get creative. And then there are some people who live always in lack, as if life is a zero-sum game and someone else's gain is my loss. There are human beings who live as though life is one interdependent community, and then there are human beings who live only America first. There is a community of love and a community of fear, and that's the divide. And that's where you have to step in and you choose your side. And I know you have. That's why you're here. The lovers need to be loud right now. So we move into this quest for a new abnormal by looking at how you've been renovated, at seeing the change in you, but then you also take an inventory of this nation and see how it's different. I may have shared a story with you before, I can't remember honestly, but I was in a city talking to a group during our Q&A, and a gentleman said, John, there are 2 news feeds in my life. One news feed is Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and it's the news. And he said, if I only look at that news feed, that's only going to give me division and negativity and bad stuff. And he said, if I only look at that news feed, I'm going to grow hopeless. But he said, there's a second news feed that I have access to. And that's in my community, in the places where I go, and the people that I know, and the community that I'm a part of. He said, if I look there and look for evidence for hope there, it's actually really easy to be hopeful. Excuse me. And so that's what I think partly we need to do right now, is to not look at what's trending and not look at Twitter and not look at social media so much that we forget that we are in the middle of this work. You are in the trenches right now. So turn your head down a bit right now and look who's in front of you. Look at the people there, the people you live with and work next to and study alongside. And try to create that new abnormal that we're talking about, that new abnormal of compassion and generosity and kindness. And it starts in the place you call home and in the conversations around the dinner table and in the quiet, intimate moments with your children and your partner and your spouse. That new abnormal begins in the friendships that you've cultivated over time, the ones that have endured, the ones that transcend religion or politics or any other manufactured barrier. That new beautiful abnormal is going to be created in the street, where you spend your days, in the churches and shops and neighborhoods that you live in and that you know from memory. The new beautiful abnormal that can make 2020 our year happens in the lives of the people whose names you know, whose stories you've participated in, whose journeys you've intersected with, and whose presence you feel at home in. The new abnormal, that new abnormal of compassion, is going to come in the way you choose to spend your resources of time and money and influence, how you decide what is worth giving yourself away for. So if we do that, even if history seems to be repeating every day, we're going to slowly and surely recreate ourselves in the place we call home. And soon we're going to wake in a day that is not the horrible day that we've gotten used to. Because you know what? If we didn't do the work in 2016 and 2017 and 2018 and 2019, George Floyd's death doesn't catalyze us into action. We don't see the outpouring we've seen if we had not prepared other people's hearts by doing the work that we do, that we've done all these years. And so the work that you do now is going to matter years from now. They often say you take life one day at a time, which is great advice, but I can't do that anymore. I have to take it like 1 hour at a time, and because things seem to change so much. But maybe we need to zoom in even more. I was at one of the protests this week in Raleigh, and a Black female pastor talked about George Floyd, that last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life. And she said, if you had 8 minutes and 46 seconds left to live, what would you do with that? If you could only have 8 minutes and 46 seconds left to speak, what would you say? And so that's what we do. We take this moment that's in front of us and we do the things that we need to do, and we say the things we need to say, and we trust that that's going to make a difference in the day. Because guess what? It's June 10th, I think, 2020. You weren't wrong about this year yet. Back in December 31st, when you had dreams and hopes and plans, you can still see them come to fruition. There's still time to make good on the promises you made to yourself or to the reality of the dreams that you dared to dream. We have 147 days. And you know what? I'm going to dare to believe that this can still be our year, actually. I was at a Q&A recently in California, probably the last date I did before this shutdown. And an elderly man took the microphone and his hand was shaking, and he paused for a minute and he said, John, what happens if he wins again? You're doing it now. They were audibly groaning, and you're probably doing it now. And I answered confidently, well, if he wins again, we're going to do exactly what we're doing right now. If he wins, we're going to do everything we're doing. We're going to speak clearly and advocate for vulnerable people, and we're going to loudly demand truth, and we're going to leverage our lives and our platforms and our influence for equality and justice and decency, because if he wins again, there will be things far more threatening than we have now. If he wins again, good people committed to our shared humanity will be more necessary than ever, and we're going to need to be more present than ever. But let's try not to have that happen. Let's try to make sure we wake up on November 4th in a very different kind of beautiful abnormal. But here's the thing, truthfully, even if we wake up on November 4th and we don't have the result we want, for those of us who will wake up and fight for equality and diversity and love and justice, it can still be our year. So be encouraged in all that you're doing, and let's create a beautiful abnormal together. I'm going to turn this over to Lisa, and if you have some questions, just want to share some thoughts, let's do that right now. I'd love to have a conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John. I know that I really needed to hear that specific message. So, and I'm sure a lot of people here needed to hear it as well. So, thank you
Thank you, Lisa.
so much for your words. Um, Now, before we get into the Q&A real quick, I do see that we have some questions coming in. So
Great.
if you haven't submitted your question yet, please go ahead and start doing that. Just a quick reminder again that if you have the means to contribute, there is a donation link pinned to the top of the chat box below. Again, every dollar donated goes towards helping and supporting local progressive candidates. So anything that you're willing to give, we would be so grateful for. And again, send your questions in. We've got one here right now, John. It says, how do you find a balance between keeping up with what's going on and not going crazy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do a workshop on compassion fatigue, and one of the things, there's sort of 10 things I kind of suggest to people as a list, and one of them is actually, if you want to avoid compassion fatigue, I tell people to get on social media, because social media can help you find your tribe of affinity. It can help you connect to people who aren't geographically where you are, and it can help you stay informed, and it can also give you a platform. But then I tell people, but if you want to stay healthy, get off social media, because what social media does at its worst is it artificially enlarges the bad news. So we see something that's real and that needs to be addressed, but then it gets retweeted and we share it and we see comments about it. And so it gets artificially enlarged. So for me, it's about knowing when all that information is becoming toxic in me, when it's only making me angry, when it's changing my breathing patterns, making me irritable. I tell people there's an engage and withdraw. That's the dance. So you engage with the world and you withdraw to the solitary places. In my faith tradition, Jesus does that. Jesus is missing. They can't find him. They're saying, Jesus, you have a 2:30 healing. Where are you? And Jesus is off by himself. I think we all have to take rest, meditation, prayer, silence, solitude, whatever it does to recharge us and recalibrate us. You expiring early is not going to help the world. So you've got to kind of pace yourself in this work.
Well, that's definitely, I'm going to be taking some of that to heart personally. um, we have another question here. It says, aside from avoiding certain topics altogether, what is your suggestion for dealing with family members that you love dearly, but are unfortunately very bigoted and narrow-minded? For instance, they understand the wrongdoing of law enforcement against George Floyd, but refuse to accept that police brutality disproportionately affects people of color more than white people, or feel the need to counter any of these facts or atrocities by minimizing the experiences of non-whites.
Well, I did on a YouTube live stream. It was like an hour-long conversation on surviving the MAGA divide. And if someone, if the viewers want to check that out, there was just a lot of specifics. But what I'll say is every relationship is so unique, and that relationship is going to ebb and flow. So I have an aunt who is very opposite me, and some days I'm able to engage her. There's some days when I feel healthy enough or detached enough that I can talk with her and we can sort of have an exchange. But some days what she's sharing is so toxic, or it's bringing out such anger in me, that I know nothing healthy is going to happen. So even in that one relationship, there are days when I fight and days that I leave. And so you have to choose your battles and choose the people that you fight those battles with, and you're going to get it wrong, right? Because this is messy. We're messing with people's stories and their preconceived ideas about what's true, especially for me, dealing with many people who have a Christian story, a God story that I'm messing with. It's hard to argue with God. And so people are going to get angry when you try to argue with their God. So it's a little bit of that relationship, and knowing when to treasure the relationship and when to speak for people whose voices are not going to be heard by that person. That's a huge part of this. You get to bring a different perspective in that they may never hear because they're only watching one network.
Oh, oh yeah, I know a lot of us struggle with that very same thing. So, um, It says, I like the idea of working on being an anti-racist because I can do that even if I recognize that I retain habits of racist attitudes, conscious and unconscious. What suggestions do you have for cultivating anti-racism?
Well, for me, it's about getting a continual flood of new and better stories and more information. So I'm listening to the voices of people of color. I'm seeking out perspectives that I haven't had, and I'm reading things that I wouldn't normally read, because those are going to give me new questions or better questions, and they're going to reveal blind spots that I could never reveal just because I wanted to reveal them. And that's the truth. Whoever asked the question, that understanding your privilege, it doesn't just happen once. It happens in layers. Every day you uncover something else. So there are things that I'm aware of because I'm really trying to become aware of them, but there are things that I'll never know. And so it's really education and getting better stories, and then having the courage to speak. A lot of times I think white people, we understand our privilege, we become aware of it, and then we either become guilty or apologetic and think, well, that means that I have to be silent. Part of the responsibility is to take the privilege and leverage that privilege so that you can lift up the voices of vulnerable people, because otherwise that guilt is just wasted. It's just narcissism. So we just channel that into something productive.
Okay, awesome. We have another question here. How do we approach friends who are obviously limiting their information sources to the conservative talking heads and conspiracy theorists?
Yeah, for me, that's just the work that I do, is that it's to say, okay, I'm going to keep throwing this out there. And sometimes you do it pointedly, sometimes you do it matter of factly, you just try to slide it in. I'm really just trying to be subversive about truth. Because when you're starved for it, the people, that woman I talked about tonight, she had a really bad story because that's the only story she has. And so there's a beautiful heart there. So part of what we have to do is realize that the people we're talking about, there's a reason they got to where they are. There's a reason that they believe what they believe. And we have to understand the forces that contributed to that, who taught them, what pastors were teaching them in their churches, who were their parents, and then realize we have to decompress them from some of that. So we're deprogramming really a lot, decades of bad news. So keep plugging away. One day something may actually click.
Yeah, that's all we can hope for, right?
That's right.
Just keep trying. Um, we have another question here, I believe. What would you say, I know you've kind of touched on this a little bit in your talk, but what would you say is the best way to channel our energy during this time? I know there's lots of opportunities out there and lots of different ways people can get involved and, make their voices heard or help elevate, people of color or just marginalized people in general. But what are some of the best ways you would think that are doable for people?
Well, I think now what we see is, there's these big events that have happened, and they're beautiful. But I wrote about it this week that after that, the polls are the next place that we begin to make this a reality. So really, to lift up candidates of color and contribute with your time and with your resources, and to really challenge people to vote differently than they may have ever voted before. Now's the time to leverage our circle of influence. And we have an audience with people, and to say, hey, here's this candidate. I want you to take a look at them because I think there are some things you agree on. That's probably the next place, because legislation is the other piece of this. When we talk about prejudice or inequality, we talk about stories and systems. We meet people, we hear those stories, and we know that those stories are why we do this work, and systems actually are the things that can affect them. And legislation it affects those systems. So the political arena, I think, for the next 147 days is a lot of where we need to be.
Yeah, I agree. We have someone here who said, my white friend who I'm very close, um, both feel both feel the real issue is not black and white, but good people and bad people. We have agreed not to label individuals as white and black, but as good or bad. What are your thoughts on that?
I was walking home from the protests in Raleigh, and there was a construction site, and someone from one of the local churches, progressive churches, had written on a concrete slab, God doesn't see color. And I thought, well, that's odd, because if you believe that God made things, God chose those colors. It's like saying Monet didn't see color, of course, or, um, the color, the difference is we need to see them. They're necessary. So yeah, there are good and bad people, but no, there are really no good and bad people. I think that's even too dualistic. But I think I want to see the differences. I want to acknowledge the uniqueness, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the surface differences that have, and the ways that we have been raised, that actually are beautiful. We don't want to pretend they're not there, because that's an insult to everyone's history and their family and their road. So I want to embrace the differences. I want to name them and celebrate them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd have to agree with you on that. Well, that looks like, I think that might be all the questions that we have for tonight. I think because I think you did a really great job of just kind of encompassing, for me, I can say encompassing a lot of the feelings that we've all been kind of experiencing and processing in this time. So I so appreciate you, because sometimes it's hard to put those feelings into words to really express how we feel. So I appreciate you for that, for sure. And just to thank you again for being here and taking time today to speak with us. And thank you to everyone who attended tonight for our part 1 of our Synergy Speaker Series. I will say we are excited to announce that our next speaker in our series is going to be Joyce Vance on June 30th. We're one of our Alabamians, we're very, very proud to claim. So be sure to save the date for that and to stay tuned to our newsletter and our social media accounts. We'll be releasing more details as well as future speakers for our series. But John, I do have to say we appreciate you being the first one kicking it off for us. I think you started in a big way, so you've set the bar really high for us tonight.
Well, it's been an honor to be with you all, and everyone, keep doing the beautiful work you're doing there on the trenches. This is how it works. You just keep doing all that you can wherever you can, and that's how we get better. So thank you.
Absolutely. And again, just last time for everyone that's still here, if you enjoyed this event and want to help support our cause, please consider donating to Persistence PAC. Again, you can go to our website, or the link is in the chat box below. But thank you all again for being here with us tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.